processed those data and created the cognition variables that would be ready to be utilized for scientific research. We do have an hour. Our studies will start with Dr. Panali, and then followed by like burning questions in case that the audience has some clarifying questions, and briefly, and then go to Dr. Arden Gross to his and followed by the Q&A for clarifying questions. All of today's talk, both slide as well as the presentation, will be available through the project website. So I would like to now welcome Dr. Panali to walk us through the cognition module.
Thank you, Jungkook. Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Dr. Pranali Khobragade, Survey Director for LASI-DAD study. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to the next session in the LASI-DAD webinar series. Today I'll be presenting about, I'll give in-depth, once again my slide. Yeah. So in today's presentation, I will provide an in-depth overview of the cognitive assessment component of LASI-DAD study. I will walk you through the cognitive assessment and administrations, and also the basic structure of cognitive testing, the cognitive domains and the various tests that we assessed, and individual cognitive test description. So before I describe the specific cognitive test, here is an outline of the sample and the administration time for the cognitive module. So on an average, cognitive module took approximately 56 minutes. And as you can see, for sample, we had drawn sample from multiple states across India, reflecting the cultural and geographical diversity. In wave 1, we interviewed 4096 respondents, and it increased in wave 2 to 4635. And of this, 2565 individuals participated in both waves, allowing longitudinal comparison. All interviews were conducted face-to-face at respondents' home. And a major development between waves was the transition from using mini laptops combined with paper and pencil assessment in wave 1 to a fully tablet-based administration in wave 2. So this is the basic structure of the cognitive assessment, where we had 3 approaches. One is self-reported cognition, where respondents reflect on and report on their own memory and thinking abilities, including how this have changed over the last few years and at present. Then we have performance-based cognitive tests, where we which enables us to gauge the cognitive capacity of the respondent through objective and validated test performance. Then we have informant reports, where someone who is known to the respondent is asked to describe any observed cognition or functional changes that they see. With this, let's begin the detailed cognitive domains and the tests that we used in LASI-DAD study. So here are the 5 cognitive domains that were assessed along with the corresponding test in the LASI-DAD. So first one, in orientation, we try to assess respondents' orientation to time and place. In language and verbal fluency, we evaluate expressive and receptive language skills. Here are the tests like retrieval fluency, CSID, object naming, HRStics, and token test. Then we have visual spatial abilities, which assesses spatial processing and visual constructional skills. Then we have memory domain, where we test encoding, storage, and retrieval of information. And lastly, we have executive functioning, which assesses planning, reasoning, flexibility, and inhibition. So looking at all the cognitive tests, I will describe each one of them in length. So here is literacy test. This was added in wave 2. It is designed to better measure literacy. So the respondents were asked to read a story aloud in any known language and answer a series of questions to assess their comprehension. Then we have Hindi mental state examination, which is a multi-part tool evaluating overall cognitive functioning, including memory, language, and orientation. Then we have telephonic interview for cognitive status. This is a brief set of questions designed to assess language ability and factual knowledge. So to enhance the cultural relevance, there was a modification made between waves. So in wave 1, the object naming task included the word coconut, which was quite unfamiliar with respondents. And that's why, as a result, in wave 2, we replaced it with the word tree to improve respondent understanding and response accuracy. Then we have CRAD word recall, immediate. It tests verbal memory through recall of 10 words over 3 repeated trials. Then we have digit span forward and backward. It measures attention and working memory by asking where we ask respondent to repeat number sequences in either forward or reverse order. Then we have symbol cancellation. This test measures attention by asking respondents to identify and mark specific target or symbols. So in wave 2, we administered the symbol cancellation test on a tablet rather than on paper. And because the tablet screen is smaller than the paper format, which was used previously, we reduced the number of symbols displayed while maintaining the same symbol size to ensure comparability and readability. CRAD word recall delayed. It tests delayed verbal memory by recalling previously presented words within a 2-minute time frame. Then we have word list recognition, where the respondents have to identify words from the original word recall list. Then we have logical memory immediate, where we assess immediate memory by recalling details from 2 short stories that were read aloud to the respondent. Then we have constructional praxis. This tests visuospatial skills by asking participants to copy geometric figures using a tablet and stylus. Then we have logical memory delayed. So we ask the respondent to remember the earlier 2 stories that they heard. Then we have logical memory recognition, where we ask respondents, like there is a 15-item recognition task based on one of the previously heard stories. Next is retrieval fluency. We assess verbal fluency by asking the respondent to name as many animals as possible within 60 seconds. Then we have constructional praxis recall, where we ask the respondent to redraw earlier shapes that they now this time from memory. Then we have hand movement sequence test. This test assesses motor sequencing by having participants follow a series of hand movements. We modified the hand sequence movement for palm up and down movement, clench and extended hand movement to require the respondent to use both hands. That added an extra challenge, whereas in wave 1, we used only one hand. Then for judgment and problem solving, we evaluate reasoning skills through questions on similarity, differences. There are simple calculations and real world problem solving questions. This module was expanded in wave 2. We included additional question on difference, like what is the difference between stone and potato? What is the similarity between table and chair? And 3 additional questions on calculation, and a question on assessing the problem solving capacity, which was like what to do if it started raining heavily when you were out. Then we have serial 7s. This tests attention and concentration by repeatedly asking respondent to subtract 7 from 100. Then we have 10 by 6 CSID. This is a brief test assessing orientation and general knowledge. So for example, we ask to identify a body part, what do you do with a hammer, or where is the local store located? Then we have Raven's progressive matrices, a non-verbal reasoning test that assesses pattern recognition and abstract thinking. Then we have go no go test, which is a impulse control and reaction time. It requires respondent to respond to go signals and inhibit responses to no go signals. Then we have trail making test, part A and B. This was introduced in wave 2. This test evaluates visual scanning, working memory, and executive functioning. To accommodate the predominantly illiterate population, we replace the traditional letters and symbols, letters and numbers with different size of circles and squares. And participants were asked to connect the shapes in specific alternating sequences, preserving the cognitive challenge while ensuring cultural and educational relevance. Here are the references of the LASI-DAD cognitive test, which were used in Wave 1 and Wave 2, and including their descriptions and administration procedures. LASI-DAD is first and only nationally representative study on the late life cognition and dementia in India. It is part of NIH, HCAP and ADSP protocol. The project is funded by US National Institute on Aging, Bright Focus Foundation, and Gates Venture. These are a team of contributing researchers and our collaborating institutions. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope this session has given you some understanding on cognitive assessment in LASI-DAD. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Ponnelly. I think there has been a couple of questions that came up, and we provided answers to those questions. So given that, I'd like to now invite Dr. Alden Gross to share what he has processed, how he has processed this various cognitive data.
I'm unmuted now. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you all and to present some of this work we've been doing with LASI-DAD data. I'm going to present on how we've developed harmonized cognitive scores that we can use to look at cognitive changes between waves 1 and 2 of LASI-DAD. And I'll then present on some analyses in which we use these scores to look at a series of risk and protective factors for cognitive change. So why are we interested in longitudinal cognitive assessment other than the fact that LASI-DAD, as Pranali mentioned just now, is the only longitudinal survey of aging that's nationally representative in India. Longitudinal cognitive assessment is really essential to the study of dementia because cognitive decline is the hallmark of dementia. There's very little research published on rates of cognitive decline and predictors thereof outside of sort of Western settings. So our goal here is to be able to characterize cognitive change in a nationally representative sample of older adults in India. We used the data from LASI-DAD. As Pranali just mentioned, there were 6,168 participants. Between her presentation and my presentation, we got an extra person. So there were 2,566 people seen across both waves 1 and 2, but as she mentioned, there was a refresher sample in wave 2 of participants who were not necessarily seen in wave 1. And you gave an excellent presentation, a rundown of the cognitive test battery. We have tests of memory and executive functioning and language, orientation and visual spatial ability. What we've done for our harmonization is to drill down, and I want to distinguish between a cognitive test and a cognitive test item. So a cognitive test might be the CIRAD wordless learning test, but a cognitive test item, there are multiple items to that test, such as the immediate recall. There are 3 trials of that test. There's also a delayed recall. There's also a recognition portion of the CIRAD. So at the end of the day, in wave 1 of LASI-DAD, there were 52 test items, and in wave 2, there were 59 test items. Most of the items overlap, and there were some differences, as Pranali also described. Now, in the next couple slides, I'm gonna run through each domain, and I'm going to describe, to give you a visual sense of the overlap. And I'm going to color code it Orange is going to indicate that a test was used in both waves. White is going to indicate that a test was used in wave one only, and green will indicate that a test was introduced newly in wave two. Just taking a step back, we knew that we did make certain adaptations in wave two. We changed certain tests from our experiences in wave one, and there were differences made in administration, in scoring of tests, and in mode of administration. So we knew about some of these things. Pranali mentioned the question about the coconut. We changed to what's a green leafy plant that has branches or something like that. We added a trail making test. There were additional questions, as mentioned previously, about judgments and problem solving. Additionally, we changed the symbol cancellation test from being a paper and pencil test to being administered on the computer. These are all potential differences that could lead to measurement differences that may confuse measurement differences with real differences in performance. And we want to be able to distinguish those things. In addition to changes that we know about, we did also empirically, statistically test for unknown measurement differences using measurement invariance testing. And about the highest level of temporal invariance, scalar measurement invariance was met. And I can talk to you about that in greater detail another time. Just a brief note on why latent variables are crucial to constructing cognitive scores to measure change. So again, as I mentioned just now, we need a score in which change reflects actual changes to the best extent possible in a person's cognitive ability, not a score that reflects changes in testing procedures. If you're going to do a cross-sectional analysis, let's say of LASI-DAD wave one, you might be persuaded to use a simple sum score of all cognitive test items. Such a sum score would probably be inappropriate for a longitudinal study because it's going to mix up true change with measurement differences. And in a table on the slide, what I'm showing here is if you do compute a composite score in which you take every cognitive test out there in wave one and you sum the raw scores, and you do the same for wave two, the mean at wave one of these scores is about 108, and the mean for wave two is about 110. That shows improvement. We should expect, especially in a sample of older adults anywhere, we should expect, especially over 6 years, we should expect decline. So if changes in a cognitive score do not show basic expected patterns, such as decline over 6 years, we probably should not trust associations with such a score in our research. So that's the goal of why we wanted to use latent variables. Now, this is a visual representation of a comparison of the LASI-DAD battery in wave one versus wave two for memory. Every test in the memory domain was consistent across both waves. For executive functioning, there were a lot of new tests in green here that were added in wave two that were not present in wave one. This is really a reflection, as Pranali just mentioned, that we realized in wave one that we needed during wave one administration, we really wanted to have more tests of executive functioning and problem solving ability. And so we added questions around similarities and differences, as well as set shifting ability in the form of the trail making test. For language and fluency, this domain was mostly consistent. There were a couple of changes in items, such as moving from the coconut item to asking about the tree. And we changed the allowable responses for the hammer item in wave one. So the question is, what do you do with a hammer? And in wave one, the permissible responses was to pound a nail into something. But in wave two, to conform with other studies in other countries, we allowed additional answers, such as to hit something or to pound something. Obviously, people can use hammers to break open a coconut. You don't just use a hammer to pound a nail into something. For orientation, this remained largely consistent across the waves. And for visual spatial ability, this was unchanged. So we then, once we had our battery and we had a sense of what was common and what was not common across the waves, we derived psychometrically comparable scores through longitudinal co-calibration. This involved estimating a confirmatory factor analysis to test items, to test the fit of items in each domain separately for each wave. We're basically making sure that if we were to construct latent variables to represent cognitive functioning, do these latent variable models fit the data and represent the data adequately? And we did this for overall general cognitive performance as well as for each cognitive domain separately. We then, for each domain, we then combined waves 1 and 2 items into a two-factor confirmatory factor analysis, applying constraints on item parameters for the cognitive test items that were in common between the two waves. This is the step that gives us cognitive scores, latent variables, that are comparable between the waves. And on this next slide, I'm showing fits of our parametric models, of our confirmatory factor analysis models to the observed data. So the fits are really strong. When you look at the root means squared error approximation, the comparative fit index, and the standardized root mean residual. What this slide is showing us is that the models for cognitive functioning are a good reflection of the underlying data that we collected. So we have strong models. So if we have good models that represent and we say it represents memory, and it does appear to represent memory in the data and executive functioning and so on and so forth. What we then want to do is we want to use these scores. Just a quick note here, there were some differences between wave 1 factor scores, which have been publicly shared for the wave 1 LASI sample of 4,096 participants, and these new factor scores. And there were largely small updates that we made, largely regarding the granularity of how certain variables were handled. And I'm happy to answer these specific questions at another time. Right. So then let's look at the rate of annual change in these cognitive scores. So the on average, participants, the wave 1 was conducted in 2017 to 2019, and wave 2 was conducted in 2022 to 2024. I think the average follow-up time was about 6 years. So what I'm showing here are coefficients for time from random effects models, which are shown on a metric in which cognitive outcomes are standardized to a mean of 0 and a variance of 1 distribution. Thus, these estimates are rates of change on a Cohen's d outcome. So typically, one should expect at least across most of the longitudinal studies that I've been involved in over the years, I expect to see on average anywhere between 0.03 and 0.05 standard deviations of cognitive decline on average. So negative estimates here suggest that there's decline, annual cognitive decline. And so we see that there's somewhat shallower decline for general cognitive performance than what I just said, but negative 0.029. That's close to negative 0.03. It's on the lower end of decline that we would expect. But we also have to keep in mind that this LASI-DAD sample includes people who are as young as 60 years of age. The benchmarks that I quoted of between 0.03 and 0.05 standard deviations per year is really refers to people who are 65 and above. By and large, you see similar levels of decline for all the domains except for language and fluency, where there's improvement over time. We then looked at, this is in the full sample, we then stratified by age. And what we see is there's progressively steeper cognitive decline with older ages. For example, for general cognitive performance overall, the rate of cognitive decline is negative 0.029 standard deviations per year. But for people aged 60 to 69, it's negative 0.021. For people, standard deviations per year. For people aged 70 to 79, that rate of decline increases to negative 0.039. And for people aged 80 plus in the LASI-DAD sample, that rate of change is much steeper at negative 0.075 standard deviations per year. So we're seeing progressively steeper rates of decline. This is what we should expect of changes in cognitive performance. And we see that pattern for just about every domain. Again, for language, it's not until age 80 years that we see decline on average. This domain is really driven by animal fluency, for which there's actually some improvement in performance. Our neuropsychological experts have told us that animal fluency is in some settings considered as a hold test. A hold test is a test that doesn't necessarily show change to a similar degree that other cognitive tests show. So this is somewhat explainable. So what we did next was we looked at associations with cognitive change. So again, wave 2 took place somewhere between 2.8 and 6.4 years after wave 1. And among the people who were the participants who were seen in both waves, we tested correlates of cognitive change using random effects models for several potential risk and protective factors. And I looked at 33 different factors. From demographics to health history factors, objective and subjective functioning, health behaviors, and sensory function. All of these risk factors were taken from the core LASI study, which was conducted even earlier than LASI-DAD wave 1. So this plot is showing beta coefficients for the effects of exposures on rates of cognitive change. So the x-axis is the association with cognitive decline. A green box indicates that associations are in a direction that one should expect. For example, the coefficient for age is negative. In other words, older age is associated with steeper cognitive decline. Meanwhile, green box to the right of the dashed lines it suggests that a factor may be associated with less steep cognitive decline. In this case, the fourth box down is marital status is associated with attenuated rates of cognitive decline. Red boxes are associations for correlates that are not in an expected direction. And the strongest correlate of steeper cognitive decline is any form of schooling. And that's the one thing that's kind of unexpected that's coming out of our study that's pretty interesting. There are lots of reasons why we might expect for education to not act in a similar way as other predictors of cognitive change. This could involve regression to the mean or a selection bias, in the sense that people with more schooling and higher cognition were more likely to survive than those with no schooling and high cognition. This could be a real effect. Education does condition people to perform well on tests. It's probably a combination of lots of these, of several explanations, and we're actively working on understanding this relationship a little bit more, because this counterintuitive finding we're finding is likely to show up for many risk factors that are correlated with education, such as bilingualism and other things. This is a description of cognitive change by age that's courtesy of our colleague Emma Nichols at USC. What this is showing is that the rate of change in general cognitive performance is relatively flat in the LASI-DAD sample for people with no formal schooling, but there's progressively steeper rates of decline with greater education. So in conclusion, we've co-calibrated cognitive domains across the LASI-DAD waves. The latent cognitive scores are useful, we think, for longitudinal as well as cross-sectional analyses. They are also shared publicly in the LASI-DAD shared data sets. And then we've evaluated associations of a variety of known risk and protective factors for cognitive change. And most of these are in an expected direction. The exception, of course, is education. It's important to note that in that forest plot that I showed, we ended up evaluating 12 of the 14 risk factors that were identified by the 2024 Lancet Commission on dementia risk. So, the LASI-DAD sample combined with the core LASI has a real potential to make a huge contribution to science and to our understanding of dementia and of cognitive change. I want to acknowledge our funders, as Pranali did earlier, as well as our prodigious group of collaborators. It really does take a team effort. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Arden. There are a couple of questions. Do you remember the details of the practice effect analysis that Eric did? The question is about how we completed, or how did we look at practice effect?
We did look at practice effects. Briefly, you can imagine, so with just 2 time points, it's difficult to disentangle practice from real change, but the LASI-DAD sample has this refresher sample of people who were seen in wave 2, but not in wave 1. So if you match those people who in wave 2 had never experienced the LASI-DAD cognitive battery before, if you match on things like age and sex and maybe state and a couple other factors to wave 1 participants when they were new, and you look at their performance and you look at the difference in their performance, you can get an idea of the degree of practice. And my memory is that I don't have Eric Meyer's results in front of me, but my memory is that some tests did show practice and some did not. But yes, those types of analyses it's difficult to be conclusive about practice effects in a study with just 2 waves, but that's why we need a wave 3.
I think my recollection is, Arden, the only cognitive domain that shows some difference was constructional praxis. However, because of there were different scorer have done the scoring of constructional praxis, we ended up rescoring and to ensure there is no cross-rater differences. And I don't quite recall whether Eric had a chance to take another look at it after the rescoring is done.
Okay. Somebody asked, is there any absolute cutoff point in this latent score to define cognitive impairment? There is, well, we haven't published one, but there could be if you wanted to do an ROC analysis and on your own and look at it. You could imagine a cutoff score for the rate of cognitive change. You could imagine a cutoff score for just point prevalence at any time at wave 1 and or wave 2. It would really depend on your scientific question, I would think. I think that for any attempt to identify cognitive impairment, you might want to consider separate cutoff scores for different demographic groups, such as cutoff scores that are different as a function of age or as a function of education or other things. But again, this also depends to some degree on the scientific question of interest that you have.
Right. Thanks very much, Arden. I don't see any further questions on the Q&A. Oops. Just before I finish the sentence, there is another question, Arden.
So there is not transfer of cognitive factors from core to wave 1. Oh, I think this person is referring to the LASI-core interview. So the LASI-core interview did have a brief battery of cognitive tests that were asked. My memory is that there were some orientation items as well as immediate and delayed word recall, just one trial of a 10-word list. We have, I want to say that we've publicly released harmonized scores between LASI-core and LASI-DAD wave 1 for general cognitive performance. We don't have enough information that in the LASI-core wave to estimate specific cognitive domains such as memory, language, orientation, and executive functioning, and visuospatial ability. But we do have a measure of general cognitive performance, which has been used. And we have equated the LASI-core with LASI-DAD wave 1. It would be probably a very simple matter to add LASI-DAD wave 2 to that, which we certainly can do. Thanks for the reminder. And then someone's asked, what's the average literacy rate of participants? Pranali or Jen Cook, do you know the answer to that?
About half of the participants are literate. Okay. Thank you, Arden, and thank you, Pranali, and thanks everyone for joining today's webinar. We will have our third webinar in a month, and on our next webinar, Dr. Joyita Banerjee will introduce the Informant report, where we interviewed cross-family members to provide us information about the respondents' cognitive status as well as their functional ability in everyday life. And also Dr. Joyita will introduce the caregiver questionnaire that we have developed to further our understanding of caregiving. And Dr. Marco Angrisani will also join the next month's webinar, providing some of the results coming out of those caregiver survey. And actually that work has been published in Alzheimer's and Dementia. he will provide some of those highlights of the findings. So thank you everybody for joining today's webinar, and wish you have good night and good day. Bye.